Shem was the great grandfather of Abraham. Look at the years that they lived. Did you know they could have known each other? How cool would it have been to have met your great, if you go back to Noah, grandfather? Y'all need to give yourself a big pat on the back. Y'all made it through chapter 1. Now, I threw in some things from different chapters in chapter 1, but we finally did make it through. Today we're going to start with chapter 2, the history of the Old Testament. So this is going to, I should have entitled this, assuming we make it, the entire Old Testament in 35 minutes. Now, when I started, I thought it was going to be the whole Old Testament in 45 minutes, so we might not make the full Old Testament. We'll see what happens. So first up, I showed you this chart before, last week before, I'm not sure, but it's the entire history of the beginning all the way through the New Testament and the period of judgment. Now, I know that's really hard to see, so we kind of went through that very briefly, but what I've done today is I've blown that up into a chart where I'm talking about just the Old Testament. So we have the beginning. Everybody has to turn their head kind of like this to read this. But we have Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, then the flood, about 2345 BC. And I told you before, we come up with these dates by kind of going backwards. We work backwards through the genealogies and come up with these dates. So about 2345 BC, the flood. And then we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then we go into slavery. Remember, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and the children of Israel went into slavery in Egypt. Then we have the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, and we go from the Patriarchal age into the Mosaic age, okay? And that happened around 1445 BC. We then have the wilderness wanderings for 40 years. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. 7 years of conquest, then the period of the Judges. When Joshua died, we enter the period of Judges for 350 years. If you want a good book to read in the Old Testament, Judges is a really cool book to read. We see about people getting their heads nailed to the ground and stuff like that, and it's really a neat, interesting book. Next up, we have the kings. The people wanted a king. They didn't want a judge anymore. So we have the period of the United Kingdom, and then the period of the divided kingdom, where Israel goes to the north, Judah stays in the south. Jeroboam in the north, Rehoboam in the south. The north is then destroyed by Assyria in 721 BC, and when I say destroyed, I mean gone. Israel's done. Their history's over. They're done. Okay? Judah, on the other hand, they were assimilated by Babylon. When I say assimilated, they were taken captive by Babylon, and then when Persia took over Babylon, Persia, the good kings of Persia, allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. And we see that with the 3 returns. The first return under Zerubbabel, when they rebuilt the temple. The second return under Ezra, when they rediscovered the law. The third return under Nehemiah, where they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. If you're at my class 4 months ago, we talked about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. We talked about rebuilding and building the walls of the temple and the Temple Mount. Okay? So that happened during the 3 returns. And then we have the end of the Old Testament. Very easy peasy. We're done. You can go home. All right, well, let's go into a little more detail than that. I like to show things in different perspectives. I like to show timelines. I like to show family trees. So you have kind of the same information just presented in a couple of different views. And sometimes I'll break that down into a more of a philosophical point of view, like I did for some of my talks 2 or 3 months, 4 months ago, whenever it was. Okay? So here's a timeline, or a family view rather, of Adam and Eve. Well, they obviously had Cain and Abel, we read about. And by the way, when we study the Old Testament, we know the stories, right? Adam and Eve, Cain killed Abel, Noah and the flood, Abraham and Isaac and the sons that came from that, and the nations were blessed, crossing the Red Sea, conquering the land. We know the story. We know the individual stories. My opinion is we don't really know how it all ties together, and that's what I'm going to do today in 32 minutes. Okay? So we have the family tree here. Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth. Now, we're interested in the Jews in this particular class, okay? So we're going to talk about the timeline of Seth. Enos, Canaan, et cetera, down to Enoch, who did not die. Methuselah, the oldest guy on earth that's ever lived, Lamech, Noah, and then Noah and his 3 sons. And then Noah and his 3 sons and their wives were the only ones that survived the flood. 8 people. We go back to these 8 people. Well, actually, we go back to one of these 8 people. We go back to Japheth. Most of the people in this room, probably. Everyone in the world comes from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. Jews and Arabs came from Shem. As we go down in time to Abraham, I'll show you a family tree in just a minute, of Shem down to Abraham. Abraham, Isaac. The Jews came through that way. Abraham, Ishmael. The Arabs came that way. So the Jews and Arabs are related to back all the way to Shem. They don't act that way today. They're a little bit of a fighting family, aren't they? The Jews and the Arabs, okay? We are, for the most part, traced back to Japheth. Caucasians, Europeans, that's us over there. Many North Africans trace their history back to Ham. So that is a family tree from Adam and Eve, from the beginning of time, all the way up through the flood. Okay? Next up, we're going to trace from the flood down to Abraham. Shem, down through all these verses, Peleg, in his time, the earth was divided. Now, when I was a kid, I read that verse and I thought, there must have been a big, big earthquake back then for them to mention in the Bible. But it turns out that during the time of Peleg, apparently that was the Tower of Babel, when the earth was philosophically and languagely, is that a word? Languagely divided. The Tower of Babel during the time of Peleg. And then we have his sons, Nahor, Terah being the father of Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham, of course, married his half-sister, Sarah. And then Haram over here was Abraham's brother, and Lot being Abraham's nephew. So, Shem was the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. Add one more great in there and you go back to Noah. So Noah was a grandfather of 8 greats down to Abraham. Look at the years that they lived. Did you know they could have known each other? How cool would it have been to have met your great, if you go back to Noah, grandfather? That would have been kind of weird, wouldn't it? I'll show you a chart of that in just a minute. So 9 generations from Shem down to Abraham. Now the family tree of Abraham and Jacob. Abraham was the father of Isaac. He almost sacrificed him, remember, on Mount Moriah. And we talk about Mount Moriah, and we talk about the Temple Mount. We'll get into that a lot of detail later on. Isaac was a son of Esau and Jacob. Jacob had all these sons and one daughter, Dinah, through Leah. 10 of those sons became 10 of the tribes of Israel. Now, we think of the tribes of Israel being the sons of Jacob, right? Well, that's not 100% true. It's 10 sons, 2 grandsons. The 2 grandsons were sons of Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim. And then Jesus came through Judah, this line right here. If you have my book, you can go look at Appendix F. I decided to leave that in there. It was kind of a leftover from when I had a chapter on the life of Jesus in there that I took out because of the size of the book. But I left that appendix in there that traces the line of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew has a forward genealogy. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat blah, 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 Jesus. Luke has a reverse genealogy. Jesus was the son, or as thought of, I think is the wording used. Jesus was the son of Joseph. Joseph was the son of blah, 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 back to Abraham. So reverse genealogy in Luke, a forward genealogy in Matthew, and I've got that in one chart in Appendix F, and I have some explanation of how that came about. Let's look at a timeline. We looked at the family trees. Here's a timeline. Adam lived a bunch of years, 930 years. His son lived 912 years. I know that's hard to see. I apologize for that. We go down through time, and then we have the flood. Methuselah, the guy who lived longer than anyone else on earth, lived 969 years. Did he die in the flood? He died the year of the flood. There's 3 theories. Either he died before the flood, or in the flood, or after the flood that same year. That covers it, right? So, I don't know. So if he died in the flood, that means he maybe became evil later in his life? I don't know, because didn't all the evil people get kind of wiped out in the flood? If he died before the flood, maybe died. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I do know that he died the year of the flood. Methuselah died the year of the flood. And then we have the flood, and notice how the timelines of the people become shorter after the flood. I don't have an explanation for that. I'm sure there's theories on why that happens or whatever, but the timelines of the people, they started living shorter lives. Up in here in the 900 years, almost 1,000 years, and then all of a sudden we have in the 200s, 150 to 200 years. Okay. Notice also, as I mentioned before, the timeline of Abraham right here overlapped the timeline of Noah at the very end of Noah's life. He could have met his great-grandfather. That's kind of cool if you look back at that. Notice also the books. In this particular, all this period of time here, this entire period of time, 3 books: Genesis, Exodus, and Job. All the rest of the Bible, the Old Testament, history books, they're beyond this period, past the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Now, when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, we don't know exactly where. This is probably the most common concept of when and how they did it. They left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, yay, maybe there, we don't know, somewhere. And then they went down to Mount Sinai, maybe there, yeah, we don't know. We don't know where Mount Sinai was. And then they traveled up, and then they basically, the thing we're pretty sure about in all this traveling is they ended up in Kadesh Barnea. This is where they sent the spies out to the land of Canaan, right up here. 12 spies out, 10 guys came back and said, no. Yeah, we really can't do that. These guys are really, really big football player-like guys, and we just can't do it. Joshua and Caleb said, oh yeah, we can kick these football players, and we'll kick them out of the land. And Joshua and Caleb lived to see that land 40 years later. And God said, you know what? You don't believe in me, then why am I going to make you wander around for 40 years? And they wandered around the wilderness of Zin here for 40 years, and then they finally conquered the land under Joshua, one of the spies. Okay? The 12 tribes of Israel. Once they conquered the land under Joshua, this is how they distributed themselves. Judah was one of the biggest tribes down here in the south in green. Simeon was kind of in the middle of Judah. Another big tribe was Manasseh. Half of them went to the west of the river Jordan. The other half went to the east. So you always hear about the half-tribe of Manasseh in your studies of the Old Testament. The half-tribe of Manasseh did this. The half-tribe of Manasseh did this. So you got to look at the western half or the eastern half. So they were a pretty big tribe. They couldn't agree on where they wanted to settle, so they ended up on both sides of the Jordan River. Okay? After, a little bit later in history we'll talk about, after the kingdom broke up, the tribes of Judah, green, and Benjamin, purple, they stayed in the south with Rehoboam. And we'll talk about that in just a minute.
Hey, Denny, where would Gaza be today on that map?
Gaza is up right here. In fact, Gaza City is right there. And the nice thing about this maps, I use a program called Bible Mapper. All my maps I generated through Bible Mapper, where you can go in and shade different areas. And it's a little bit flaky program because it sometimes crashes or whatever, but it's really good. But it also keeps up with the cities that exist at a particular time. So if you put in that you're interested in the intertestament times, it will pop up the cities that they believed happened, that existed at that time, and their names. And we talked about last week how the names changed from Stratos Tower to Caesarea, from Samaria to Sebas or whatever. So depending on the period of time you bring up, it'll change those names for you, which is kind of cool. Okay? Next up, the judges. When Joshua died, God put judges over the land of Israel. And they had all these cycles. So the judges ruled for about 350 years. Notice the cycles of sin, servitude, repentance, salvation, and rest. Some of these judgeships overlapped. And we'll see where they came from here in just a minute. And the last 2 judges were Eli and Samuel. They're not talked about in the book of Judges, but they are talked about in the book of 1 Samuel. Okay, so Samuel was the last judge of Israel, and then we got to get into the United Kingdom when they appointed Saul as the first king. Let's blow this up. So notice these cycles: sin, This black arrow, servitude, and I give the name of who they were servants of, but in this case the Mesopotamians. That's that red arrow. And then they repent, this brown arrow, and then they have salvation through a judge, in this case Othniel, and then they have a period of rest, in this case 40 years. So anyway, the judges, the land of the judges is here in green, and the hometowns of the judges I point out here, and I know that's pretty hard to see. Toward the end of this period, 350 years, the people became unhappy. They said, Philistines have a king, the Ammonites have a king, we want to be hip. We want a king. And they did. They demanded a king, and Samuel was the last judge, and he anointed Saul the first king. I think Samuel was kind of bummed out. But God told him, they haven't rejected you, they rejected me from being a king over them, 1 Samuel 8:7. So Samuel anointed Saul in 1050-ish BC. When Saul dies in battle with the Philistine, David is then anointed. David rules in Judah for 7.5 years, while Saul's son Ishbosheth ruled everything else except for Judah. Okay? There was a civil war between David and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and when Ishbosheth finally died, David was then anointed king over the entire kingdom, and he reigned grand total for about 40 years. After David died, the kingdom was split into two, and then Solomon's son in the south and Jeroboam in the north. When they broke into two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, around 930 BC, Jeroboam in the north, Rehoboam in the south, Judah and Benjamin kind of combined into one kingdom called Judah, and then one kingdom called Israel. I know you have trouble seeing this, but I've come up with a little ditty. I've taught a lot of Old Testament classes over my life, I guess, and I never could really keep straight stuff. Who was in the north, who was in the south, what's their name, what kings, whatever. I came up with this little ditty, and it's alphabetical. Let me go forward first and show you this, and I'll go back. In the Israel, I comes before J. Israel is in the north, N comes before S. Everything alphabetical, everything comes first alphabetically in the north, and everything comes second alphabetically in the south. So Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The north and the south. The kingdom, Israel, Judah. Jeroboam was the king of the north because J comes before R. There were 10 TE tribes in the north and 2 TW tribes in the south. Samaria was the capital in the north. Zion, okay, I'm cheating a little bit here. Another name for Jerusalem was the capital of the south. They were conquered by Assyria, Israel was. Judah conquered by Babylon. A comes before B. And it turns out that Babylon conquered Assyria and Persia conquered Babylon. Again, alphabetical. Wow, that's pretty cool. So if you can't remember, did Assyria take Israel, Judah? Well, just remember this alphabet thing, okay? Last king, Hoshea in the north and Zedekiah in the south. So let's go back. That's what these little blue boxes, these purple boxes here, Judah in the south and a green box in the north. Alphabetically, it's very easy to keep up with these things now. All right, now we get into the divided kingdom. Solomon dies, Rehoboam becomes king, his son, and Rehoboam was not a good guy. I mean, he just was not a good guy. And he asked his young friends, what should I do to keep these people in line? They're just not in line. The young people said, you need to be harder on them, tax them more, be mean to them, and it didn't work out for them so good. So 10 of the tribes, they went north with Jeroboam. 2 of the tribes, as I mentioned before, stayed in the south with Rehoboam. Judah and Benjamin stayed in the south. And then they had kings, northern kings of Israel, I before J, and southern kings of Judah. I know this is hard to see, and there's a lot of information on this chart. When you write a book, I discovered this, you'll go back in the book and you'll look at something, you say, I just wish I'd done that different. I just wish I'd done that different. And the charts on page 58 and 59, I think it is, Yeah, 58 and 59 of the kings, I just never liked those charts. For one thing, if you have my book, you'll see they're vertical chart, they're vertical timelines, and they don't match anything else in the book. And I've always kind of wanted to go back and redo those. So if I ever put out a second edition of the book, I'll probably go and put these charts in the book. These charts now match the format of all the other charts in my book. And that's important because notice that we have these color codes over here. If somebody is in green, that means they ruled alongside someone else. If someone is in red, that means they ruled alongside someone else. If it's red and green, if the colors are conflicting, red, green, green, red, whatever, they ruled in opposition to each other. So Tibni and Omri ruled in opposition to each other. See the double star? We see they ruled in opposition to each other. If they're green, green, or later on when we get the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and it gets just a bundle, it's a mess when we get to them, but we'll see a lot of this opposition and stuff that we'll have to actually start using more colors. But if you see green, green, that means they ruled in peace and harmony with each other. In this particular case, a vice regency. A vice regency is where a son ruled as a subordinate to the father as king. A co-regency is where two kings ruled together, equal powers. Okay? So co-regencies, vice regencies, there were peaceful reigns, but there were certainly non-peaceful reigns as well, Tibni and Omri in this particular case. So notice the star, 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 and 3 stars. And we also have another guy, Ahaziah of Israel, was a son of Ahab and Jezebel. So this Ahaziah right here was a son of Ahab. This Ahaziah right here was the grandson of Ahaz. Okay. Notice the relative stability of the kingdom. When we get to the Seleucids and Ptolemies, we'll see this at the beginning of the kingdom. We'll see a lot of blue, sole leaders, one king. We'll see a lot of green, co-regencies, vice regencies, happiness. Everybody's happy. Let's all rule together, all right? That's the first of the kingdom, Seleucids and the Ptolemies. As we go on in history, though, we'll see a lot of red and green started showing up in these different rules, okay? That shows the kingdom is starting to crumble from within with this conflict going on between these kings. One king will rule one area, another king will rule another area, and they'll be fighting each other all the time. That's an instability of the kingdom. But for the most part, the kingdom of Israel and Judah were fairly stable up to this time. Now, don't make the mistake. I had trouble. I debated whether to put the prophets on here, and it was hard to kind of fit them into the chart. But Micaiah, who prophesied in 856 BC, you need to be sure and look down the chart. So he prophesied against Ahab, looking timeline-wise. Don't make a mistake of looking across the chart this way. So he had nothing to do with Jeroboam. I just had to put him somewhere in the chart where he would fit. So timeline-wise, he fits with Ahab. And Elisha here fits with the periods down here. And then, of course, the timeline stays the same down to the kings of Judah. All right. Next up, the second part of the chart, we notice that Israel is destroyed by Assyria in 721 BC. As I mentioned, they were completely destroyed. They were taken away. I've mentioned 2 or 3 times, 7 times, 32 times, or something, that Assyria, their modus operandi, was to take people, rip them out of their land, and put them over here. And they would take some people over here and rip them out of their land and put them here. This is why the Samaritans and the Jews did not like each other. That's why the Jews particularly didn't like the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a half-breed, according to the Jews, because they intermarried with these heathens that came in from Assyria, that Assyria had placed over there, and intermarried with the Jews. That's the conflict in the New Testament between the Samaritans and the Jews. We also see the kingdom of Judah continued for quite a few more years, but was finally assimilated by Babylon in 586 BC. Now, Babylon had a little bit of a different philosophy. They did uproot people, but it took them back to Babylon. Daniel being a good example of that. Daniel has 3 friends, other friends, whatever. So they were uprooted and taken back to Babylon. And then later on, the Jews were allowed to return when Persia took Babylon. So, in the New Testament, we have, talking about Assyria uprooting people and moving them back and forth, whatever, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. we read about in Luke chapter 10. The Samaritans, despite their history, could be more compassionate than Jews, or particularly priests or Levites, the ones who were looked up to in the community. The 10 lepers, despite their history, the Samaritans would be more thankful than others. Remember, Jesus healed 10 lepers. 9, yay, were healed, and they went to their family. 1 came back. Who was the guy that came back? Oh, he was a low-down, dirty Samaritan. What a lesson. What a lesson in that. The Samaritan woman at the well, the Samaritans, notwithstanding their history, could be more open to the messiahship of Jesus than even the Jews could be. That's what the Assyrians gave us when they displaced these people. Next up, we see the Jews returning to their homeland, starting under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus and the Persians took over Babylon. They conquered Babylon. And Cyrus, he was a good guy. He's actually mentioned in the Bible. And it says that, he was a good guy, and he allowed the Jews to come back and rebuild their homeland. He came back, or he sent back, first of all, Zerubbabel, who came back and rebuilt the temple. He sent back Ezra later on, and I'll show you the timeline of this in just a minute. And Ezra rediscovered the law. And then he sent back, later on in history, not Cyrus, but later on in history, Nehemiah went back under Artaxerxes, and Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. So we see a rebuilding of Jewishism here. The walls, the temple, and discovering the law because of the good kings of Persia. Now remember the chart I had before when I was talking about the patriarchal age? I showed 3 books, Genesis, Exodus, and Job. This shows the Mosaic age. And you basically have the rest of the books of history of the Old Testament. You see the remainder of Exodus here at the very end. We see the very tail end of Exodus sneaking over into the Mosaic age. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay? Then we get into later history, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. That, my friends, is the history of the Old Testament. That's the history that we learn about in the Old Testament from those particular books. Everything else is poetry or whatever, but these are the history books, ending with Nehemiah in 425 BC, right here. Now, blown up here from their crossing the Red Sea to when the kingdom fell, the northern kingdom of Israel fell here, we see these prophets, or people who lived. People are in blue. We see events in black. We see prophets in purple here, Jonah, Amos, Hosea. And we also see, of course, the books in red. We see people again here, the king, Saul, David, Solomon, 40 years apiece, as the united kingdom, and then it breaks up into 2, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. We see the prophets here in the south. And that history is covered by these books, 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Kings, and then by the time we get to the return, we see the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And Nehemiah, his life continued beyond the end of the Old Testament just a little bit. And of course, we have the prophets down here who prophesied during the time of the Persian return, okay? On this chart also, I have the temple. We're going to talk about the temple a lot in a few weeks. But the first temple was 480 years from the Red Sea, and it was built in just a very short amount of time, and then it lasted this long, but it was destroyed by Babylon, okay, in 587 BC. And again, I'll talk about that, or if you've been in my class 4 months ago or whatever, I did talk about that. I like this chart. I know you have trouble seeing it, but there's a lot of information on this chart. It's on page 63 of the book if you want to go look at that. But up here I have the different kingdoms, okay? The Assyrian Empire, this little black box right here, has a little red arrow that shows they were subsumed by the Babylonian Empire. Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, was subsumed into the Babylonian kingdom in 586 BC. There's a red arrow there going up to the Babylonian kingdom. Judah was then in Babylonian captivity for this number of years. Then Babylon fell to the Persian Empire, right here. And then just a year later, we see that Judah is allowed to return to the promised land by the decree of Cyrus. Now, as I mentioned last week, we need to look at the whole world, right? So if we look at the whole world, we see that a bunch of stuff was going on. Confucius, who lived in China, is this top light blue box here that you can't see. But he lived at the same time as these kingdoms were transitioning. When Babylon fell is when Confucius lived. When Persia allowed the Jews to return is when Confucius lived. Buddha also lived during this time. Socrates, this line right here, he lived in the later part of the Persian Empire. Okay? Babylonian kings in red, the last one, Belshazzar. Persian kings, starting with Cyrus the Great, who allowed them to return, and then, of course, Artaxerxes here, who allowed Nehemiah to return, as we just saw in the chart before about the returns. Here we have Bible events. Daniel and his friends were deported to Babylon at this little dot right here. Ezekiel and 10,000 captives were taken here. The destruction of Jerusalem happened here. And then we have the decree by Cyrus right here, where it allows the Jews to return. Again, I know you can't see that. I apologize for that, but if you have the book, you can look at that. The temple reconstruction began in 536 BC right here. Then we have the returns. We read about in Ezra chapter 1 through 6, we see Zerubbabel returning and rebuilding the temple. In 583, we read about the events in Esther, about the Jews almost being exterminated, but because Esther was so brave, they were not exterminated. We then read in Ezra chapter 7 through 10, the second return of 1,700 people. And then we read about the third return in the book of Nehemiah in 444 to 425 BC, and that's where the Old Testament ends. At the very bottom, we have the prophets. We see that Zephaniah prophesied back here early on, Jeremiah prophesied for a long time, Ezekiel, etc., and then on into the Persian king prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, etc. Okay? We have covered now the interpretation of the dreams in red that are in Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8. Now, we're just touching on this today, but we're going to go through this in a lot of detail starting next week, I hope, when we start talking about the prophecies of Daniel and how they foretold the coming of these particular kingdoms, and particularly the coming of the little horn, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that we don't know anything about. You know, we don't study Antiochus IV Epiphanes at all. But Daniel prophesied about him. He was a bad, Seleucid king who came in and did bad things to the Jews. And we'll read about that and how that precipitated the Maccabean revolt and how that precipitated the Hasmonean dynasty and how that precipitated the Herodian dynasty later on that we see opening the pages of the New Testament. In green here, we see intertestament things, and in brown, we see New Testament things. So Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream up here, and Nebuchadnezzar said, I saw a head of gold. And Daniel said, you are the head. And Nebuchadnezzar said, all right, I'm the head of gold. I'm the guy. I am the guy, because head of gold is always better than silver or bronze or certainly iron. And then you got iron and clay. Who wants to be that? Nobody wants to be that. But then we see a kingdom come along, a rock that becomes a great mountain, and that is the kingdom of God. But we'll study all that in Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8. So, I didn't know if I'd get to this chart today, but I did. So let me just quickly go through. We have studied, mostly autonomous, from the beginning to 1980 BC. We studied Egyptian bondage. They were mostly autonomous again when they returned to the land of Israel. They wandered around for a while and then returned to the land. And then we have the Babylonian captivity, and then the Persian period where they were allowed to go back. And then starting right here, we haven't talked about that at all. We haven't talked about the Greek period yet at all. And we will talk about that next week. We talk about, guess who the Greek was? The main guy, Alexander the Great. Everybody knows that, right? Alexander the Great came along and he just conquered everyone. And I showed you the chart of that last week. I showed you the animated map of some stuff going on. Persia, this giant empire, and some stuff going over here in Macedon and Greek. And then all of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. And Alexander the Great just takes over the entire Persian kingdom. He just crushes it in just a very, very short amount of time. And then when he dies, that kingdom then breaks up into several other kingdoms. So we'll talk about that next week. And then the next week, If we can cover that in a week, we'll start talking about the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and then that will lead into the Macedonians and the Hasmoneans. Okay? I am finished early. This has never, ever, ever happened in the history of mankind. So, if y'all want to go ahead and go, don't run up and down the halls and act like crazy children. Okay? Thank y'all for being here. We'll see you next week, I hope.